Hey guys, I'm Ted and welcome back to our lecture series. And before we begin our lecture for today, but before we wrap up our lecture on the Civil War's key battles, I simply like to do our quick recap and touch bases on where we left off in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we looked at Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, and Antietam, looking at the unique circumstances surrounding those battles and the social, political outcomes of those battles. Antietam, of course, stopped Lee with a great tactical victory for the United States, enabled Lincoln to take the initiative and to block foreign intervention from taking place in the Civil War early on. Chancellorsville was a tremendous victory for the Confederate States. It's often cited as Lee's magnum opus, so to speak. It's great work as far as being a general. It is also cited as being a determinative factor in the United States military, in the Army of the Potomac, to persevere, to shoulder the cost, to keep marching forward, to keep pushing, so that they could eventually defeat Robert E. Lee. And of course, we began to look at Gettysburg. We saw that there was a plan early on to send troops west to aid the Army of Tennessee in confronting Ulysses S. Grant. Robert E. Lee did not want to divide his armies. He wanted to invade the North again. We saw that decision led him to Gettysburg, and that Gettysburg was a defeat for Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And it is to that battle and examining the outcomes of Gettysburg that we turn to now. And so when we look at the Army, the Battle of Gettysburg and the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, the United States had additional defenses that the Army of the Potomac could have been poured into. When we look at Gettysburg, if Lee had succeeded in flanking the Army of the Potomac on the second day, Meade could have retreated. He would have retreated. He would have retreated to Pipe Creek, or he would have went to Washington, D.C. Both of those places were prepared defenses. Washington, D.C. during the Civil War was the most heavily defended city in the world. Washington was defended by a ring of forts, connected by trenches, and defended by an entire Army Corps. Lee could not have destroyed the Army of the Potomac or threatened Washington, D.C. if Lee had swung up to Philadelphia or even into Pennsylvania, into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If he had gone anywhere in Pennsylvania, he would have found defensive structures there to impede his advances. Without the capture of Washington or the destruction of the Army of the Potomac, there would have been little benefit for his move north. The French and the British were not going to intervene at this point, given the Emancipation Proclamation and other factors that had emerged. The British and the Russians were in a very tense spot. They were both contesting each other. They were both contesting each other for territory. War seemed very likely between those two. In 1863, the loss of Canadian territory and the loss of commerce with the United States tempered British intervention. The British also would have also had to found new sources for cotton. They had noted in earlier lessons. They went to Egypt, they went to India, they developed new sources of cotton. This lessened the appeal of Confederate cotton. This lessened their need, their impulse to support the Confederate States. The French too. The French were deeply entwined in European affairs as well as Mexican affairs. Napoleon III was maintaining the Austrian Archduke Maximilian as the Emperor of Mexico, and he had troops. In Mexico, and they were facing a very popular uprising. Benito Juarez would emerge as a hero in this war, but Benito Juarez and other Mexican nationals were opposing the imposition of a foreign national of foreign powers adventuring into Mexico. They were about to embark on a campaign that would oust the French and the Austrian Archduke from Mexico. In Europe, the French were eyeing the actions of the upstart Hohenzollern kings of Prussia, and the real upstarts of them all, the House of Savoy in Sardinia. Both of them were rapidly uniting the German and Italian states respectively. Also, the day after Vicksburg surrender, so that really that really sort of tempered the will or the desire of these European power to go and gamble on a chance. You know, it would have been easy to say, yeah, we'll go to war with you and commit limited troops to the United States when the Confederate States were winning a war, but you're not going to go in there to prop them up and do most of the heavy lifting. You don't like them like that. You don't know them like that. So foreign intervention at this point would have been a non-essential. And without the destruction of the Army of Potomac or the capture of Washington, Lee would have had really nothing to show. Winter would have come, and him and his army would have been out of luck. They would have been forced to leave without anything to show for it. Now, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, they were far from finished after their defeat at Gettysburg. Lee had lost a significant amount of his soldiers, but his opponent, George Meade, failed to pursue him and outright defeat or capture Lee and his army. Grant's victory at Vicksburg led to his promotion to command over the entire United States Army in the West, and his victories at Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, and of course Missionary Ridge led to Grant's promotion to Lieutenant General and command over the Army of the Potomac. Grant then went on to defeat Lee. He went on to press Lee. He went on to push Lee, to confront him, to give him no break, no mess, no rest, no nothing. He did all that. He pushed Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia to their breaking point, and they broke. He did this not by using his tactical genius, which he employed against his opponents in the West. He did this by bleeding Lee's army battle by battle. Grant also he also knew that it just couldn't be against Bobby Lee. Grant's strategy was to confront him all along Virginia, to just confront Robert E. Lee, while Sherman and other units would advance on other key Confederate spots. Mobile was a hot spot, was a big place they wanted to take. Mobile, Alabama, and of course Atlanta, Georgia. These were all hot spots, breaking the Confederates multiple fronts, stressing Lee to the limits, and then stressing the other areas. This is how you break the Confederate States. This was all a part of Grant's great strategy. Now, Benjamin. With the Army of the Potomac confronting the Army of Northern Virginia, Benjamin Butler would move along the James River and threaten Richmond. He would move to cut Lee's supply lines. Franz Sigel would move along the Shenandoah Valley to deny Lee's armies the resources from there. Nathaniel Banks would move out against Mobile, Alabama, which was the last prominent southern port still open, and of course Sherman was moving through the heartland, waylaying the Confederate capacity to make war. Now, this plan was sound, but and well thought out, but it failed. It failed miserably. Butler failed, Sigel failed, and Banks failed. Sherman did advance from Chattanooga to Atlanta, but he did so very slowly, given the poor infrastructure and the tactics of a very resourceful Joseph Johnston. Lee defeated Grant time and time again, but Grant continued to confront Lee, leading Lee deeper and deeper into Virginia, not giving him any rest, and eventually pinning him down. Now, as noted in our previous lecture, Grant's strategy was controversial, and it remains so. It led to massive casualties. massive casualties. Grant suffered more casualties than Lee's, but Lee's casualties were consistently a higher percentage of his armies and his total force. Grant was bleeding Lee's army of men while simultaneously stretching his supply lines to their limits. Grant became known as the Butcher Grant or Grant the Butcher. To make matters worse, all of this was happening during the 1864 election. To compound that, Sherman had made no gains against Johnston in the Confederate interior, and the Confederate General Jubal Early emerged from the Shenandoah Valley and was menacing Washington. These events stoked the peace sentiment, causing that to rise. It stoked the Democratic fire in the United States. The Democratic Party was now on a roll. They nominated the popular General George McClellan, who advocated peace and recognition of the Confederate States. It really looked as though things were bleak. Things were going to go down, that the United States wasn't going to win the war and that the Confederate States were going to win. But then Atlanta happened. So Atlanta, the Battle of Atlanta happens with this dramatic backdrop. Sherman comes in July of 1864. He's still pressing towards Atlanta. He's still fending off Joseph Johnston. In July of 1864, the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, relieves Joseph Johnston and replaces him with John Bell Hood. And we see a reverse of what was happening in the United States. In the United States, you had Lincoln replacing his army commanders because they did not give him the victories that he wanted, and now we see Jefferson Davis doing the exact same thing. Joseph Johnston isn't given Jefferson Davis the victories that he wanted, so he puts John Bell Hood in charge to confront William Sherman and to stop him from making his advance towards Atlanta. Hood was aggressive but incompetent. He was an incompetent commander who openly challenged Sherman to battle. And at Peachtree Creek and Ezra Church, he was defeated. Hood lost so many men in battle against Sherman that he could not prevent his supply lines from being threatened or Sherman's eventual occupation of Atlanta, which coincided with Admiral Farragut's victory at Mobile and Sheridan's victory in the Shenandoah Valley over Jubal Early. Now, these miraculous events propelled Lincoln and the Republicans to massive re-election in 1864. The capture of Atlanta allowed Sherman to begin his in-country destructive march through Georgia and the Carolina Low Country. Atlanta was crucial. Had Atlanta not taken place, the victories in the Shenandoah Valley wouldn't have meant so much. Mobile Bay wouldn't have meant so much. Atlanta definitively broke the Deep South in two. Atlanta was the junction point through which goods from Mississippi and Alabama and southeastern Georgia passed and went to North Georgia, southwestern Georgia, went to northeastern Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Atlanta was the junction. Atlanta was that crucial junction, that crucial link. Without Atlanta, the Confederacy was simply broken in two, and the infrastructure just suffered one more devastating blow. They were just curtailed that much more. Atlanta did that on the scene, but it also proved that the United States were going to win the war. The victory started rolling in again. You always feel bad when things aren't going your way, but when things start going your way, you begin to feel much better about it, begin to care about it much more deeply. And that's what Atlanta did. Atlanta allowed the United States to the civilian population to feel that much more encouraged, that much more comfortable voting for Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. So we see the importance of Atlanta that way. Now, uh, wrapping everything up, battles. Battles are only good for their political consequences. Battles are political devices. And as such, they always have political goals. Now, Antietam and Atlanta stand out ahead of Gettysburg as being central to the United States victory. Vicksburg, which occurred simultaneously, had a much larger impact at the time, since it split the Confederate States in two and led to Grant's appointment as commander of all the United States forces. Only as I stated earlier, only the unlikely scenario of Lee's complete destruction of Meade's army or his capture of Washington could have been any more momentous for those living through the Civil War. Gettysburg could have been more impactful if one or both of those armies had been destroyed. If the army of Northern Virginia had been completely wiped out, completely destroyed at Gettysburg, it would have been more impactful. If Lee had won Gettysburg and had destroyed Meade's army, Gettysburg would have been more impactful. But had none of those things happened, it sort of limits the key role of Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg is still looked to as the turning point of the war, and its size and the romanticizing of Robert E. Lee and the need to look back and identify and glorify a single event as the cause or reason for something is another event. It's terrible in history to, or really not just history, but in anything, in any aspect, it's always terrible to look back and say that this one event, this one solitary event is the reason why or the reason because something happened. There's always a multitude of events, a multitude of reasons. Very rarely can you adequately point to one event. And even when you can point to one event or one thing, that one thing is inexplicably tied to multiple other events. It's a sort of a linchpin in a whole system of things, in a whole constellation. But Gettysburg is singled out because the United States, because of a number of things that occurred afterwards. For example, no one knew at the time, but Lincoln would deliver the Gettysburg Address, one of the most eloquent speeches, one of the most eloquent deliveries in our history. Everyone knows that 80 years. Also, the cemetery, the cemetery dedicated to the United States soldiers who died there. Those things sort of compound on Gettysburg and sort of form a triumvirate. Well, really, not even a quadrant, but a quadriset that includes the battle, the defeat of Lee, the address, and the cemetery. They all come together to make Gettysburg loom larger over all the other battles, all the other instances in the Civil War. And that right there sort of brings a conclusion to our lecture. And as always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to examine with the battles, with the battles, and also looking back to the key battles of the Civil War. I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.